Okay, Tom, on to forum submitted questions. I have two questions here about consciousness evolution from Eric V. The first is, when an enlightened master such as the Buddha or Lao Tzu passes away, will he be born as an enlightened master right from the beginning of his next lifetime, or would he have to do some work first in order to arrive at the point where he left off in his past experience packet? And secondly, does an IUOC, an individuated unit of consciousness, reach a point in its evolution where it no longer needs to play an avatar?
Okay. The answer to the first one is it does have work to do in order to get back to the point of where it was. And we already discussed that just a little while ago, that you come here with the potential, with a proclivity, with a sense perhaps of intuitive understanding, but nothing specific, nothing, no facts, if you will. You're going to have to relearn all that, reapply it, and it's in the application. It's in the choices that you make in that particular experience packet. You'll have an opportunity to redevelop these things. Okay? And the choices you make will be different because it's a whole different experience. It's a different framework in this next life. But if that's the way you are inside, that's your quality, you will tend to make choices that represent who you are inside. But you could make bad choices or something else, and maybe de-evolve a little bit. You always have that potential, but you come in with a probability of making choices that will support the level to which you started with, at least. But you have to earn it. You still have to make those new choices in that new format, that new set of choices that defines your new incarnation. You still have to make all those choices and reaffirm what you know. Make those choices on a level that is in consonance with what you came in with. Start making at least choices that are really an expression of you. And you could de-evolve. You could get your intellect wrapped around, getting rich quick or something like that, and end up making a whole bunch of bad choices. Well, then that means you really didn't have that securely to begin with. Because if you'd had that idea about getting rich really wasn't an important thing to do and could be a problem. If you didn't have that, then, or if you did have that, if you already learned that lesson very firmly, you wouldn't have that problem. So what it does to start over, if you will, means you get to see whether you really did learn it or whether you just think you learned it. Because after all, once we get to the point that we've learned a lot of this, it's really hard to separate how much of it we really learned and how much of it do we just understand. How much can you separate, I'm doing this because I think I should, or I know I should, or I'm doing this because that's a representation of who I am. See the difference between acting and being. Well, eventually that difference between acting and being as you grow up can get kind of hard to differentiate. Which is it? What am I doing? I've been being kind so long that it just seems natural to me to be kind. But am I being kind because I thought that that's what I should do, I'm acting, or because that's who I am? Eventually it gets hard to tell if you've been doing it for a long time, you see. It could just be habit of acting. And you haven't really learned that lesson at a deep level. You haven't changed, in which case you may think that you're a very evolved person and so on, but you may not be quite as evolved as you thought, even though everything you said and did seemed to be highly evolved, because a lot of it was maybe your understanding, not just your being. Much of it may have been at your intellectual level. So it's good that we start at the beginning and have to reaffirm what we know through the choices that we make in a totally different context, because now the habits have to be redone. The old habits don't work anymore. We're in a different place, different people, different situation. Old habits don't apply. So we can't rely on habits making us look good. We need to actually make choices. And so even the Buddha or Lao Tzu, when they come back for another experience packet, they have to take what they've learned, apply it here in a new context, and then go on up from there. So no, they don't just pop in at 45 years old and become another master that walked out of the woods, from nowhere. Though that's possible, that's generally not the way it's done. The second question: does a avatar reach a point where he no longer plays? Does an IUOC reach a point where he no longer plays an avatar in a VR? Well, no. The other part was, since participating in a VR is no longer relevant to its evolution, if it is in any situation where it has experiential experience, if it has experience, if it's an experiential anything, then it is in a VR. You only get experience, you can only experience in a VR where there's a rule set, where there's rules that define that experience. Now, it may be a very, very light rule set, not a real tight one like we have here in this virtual reality. The rule set may not be much more than communication protocols, so we can communicate with each other, but that's a rule set. That's a little rule set that we abide by just to communicate. So it could be simple, but it's still a VR. If you're going to experience, you have to experience relative to some, if you're playing a game of any sort, the game has to have rules. If there's no rules, then there's no game. So to say that they don't get in a VR anymore is not the case. You're always in a VR if you're experiencing anything. Experience only happens in VRs. Otherwise, you're just consciousness. And if you're just consciousness, you're part of the larger conscious system, then that's the creator of the VRs, if you will. But the IUOCs are something separate. Okay, now they're a part of consciousness, but they're a part that's, in a way removed, just like your arm is something separate, from your leg. It's removed, and it has its own free will, and it has a virtual reality in which it can interact, even if that's just language. The consciousness system is just this monolithic thing. So if you're a part of it, then you are not any longer using a free will or making choices. You're just a part of it. Now, it has free will and can make choices, but you don't anymore. Your IUOC is just a part of the larger system. Then you're basically gone, and you are just become another piece of that monolithic one thing with its one free will and its choices that it makes. You're no longer an independent player anymore. So in order to be an independent player, you need a virtual reality to live in, to communicate with. So everybody has a VR. Now, we can imagine that what he meant was, do you reach a point, does an IOC reach a point where it no longer plays in a VR with a very strong rule set like this one, one that seems physical, a reality that is very interactive like a physical reality? Is that true? Well, yeah, that could be true. You could get to a point where you would rather be doing something else. But mostly the answer would be no, because this isn't just about the individual. The individual, when an individual grows up and becomes love, then it's about other. It's not just about what's good for me. All right, I've beaten this game. I want to go on to the next level. Well, if there's challenges for you in the next level for growing up still, then great, go on to the next level and grow up there. But mostly our challenges are how we interact with other people. It's our interactions with other entities that defines what's important. So if you're interacting with other entities, it's not about you. It's not like how high can I go? How can I go up to a point where, I don't have any people to interact with anymore? It's just all about me. Well, not if you're grown up. If you're grown up, you say, no, gee, there were a whole lot of people in that last reality I was in that need a lot of help. I could be useful there. You see, it's about giving. It's about other. So you don't just grow up because it's only about me and I'm going to grow up. And now that I'm grown up, I don't have to mess with those people anymore. That's not grown up. That's self-centered. So it doesn't work like that. It's not that you graduate until there is nothing to graduate for, and then you spend eternity playing harp on a cloud. It's not that sort of thing. You grow up, and in the process of growing up, you care about others. when you care about others, you've always got something to do. You always have challenges. You always have something to engage with that's profitable both for you and for other people. So growing up means becoming other-centered. That's becoming love. It's about others. You don't become love and then go off by yourself because you have disdain for the lowly people that you no longer can learn from. See, only if it's about you do you have that attitude. So these people who grow up would be eager to participate in a VR like this because they could be helpful. They could be part of the solution here. It's not about them. It's about what can they contribute to the whole. And everything in that larger conscious system is the whole. How can they contribute to that? Well, sitting on a cloud and playing your harp forever is not a big contribution. See, that's a self-centered picture. So mostly no, that's not the case. People stay in the game. They come to help because they're other-centered, not self-centered.
All right, Tom, thanks for clearing that one up. The next one is from our good friend Bartosz. He submitted it beginning of July, so we apologize that we didn't get round to doing it in the last Fireside Chat. He writes, Tom, I've recently come across a person exploring the esoteric knowledge, and one thing got me intrigued. He said that here in the physical materiality, it's really hard to distinguish who we really are. There is the mind with its personality, running thoughts, goals, and logic processes. Then he distinguishes the subconsciousness or the soul, which has mental capacities of, say, a 2-year-old. That is the powerful side of us that accepts all sorts of programming. It has its goals, its desires, its passions, and drives our motivation. But alas, even that can be set aside as not being actually ourselves. His logic process here goes as such. If it can be observed, it's not really you. We observe our emotions and thoughts, therefore we are neither our thoughts or our emotions. He asks if he thinks that is actually right. This person who is exploring this esoteric knowledge says he calls the true me the observer. So, Tom, I wonder how this model intertwines with MBT and what commentary you could provide regarding this. Perhaps if you could just do a quick recap on consciousness, both the big C and little C's, IUOCs, FWAUs, and most importantly, what a regular person here in physical matter reality is able to juice out of all of it themselves without actually reaching out to the non-physical experientially. In way of a shortcut, he says, if we assume that our true me can be best be experienced from a state of point consciousness, who are we right there and then at that very moment? Are we the RUOC or are we the free will awareness unit?
Okay, that's about 10 questions or so that we've run across there in that in that paragraph. But let's see, I've got it pulled up so I can keep up with this one. Otherwise I would never remember all of that.
Yeah.
So
that is a doozy. Okay. You're right.
So he talks about, if it can be observed, it's not you. We observe emotions and thoughts, therefore we're neither. And then he says, is that right? Well, yes, that is right within the context that is being used there. That's the idea of a camera cannot take a picture of itself. Okay. Now, when that's a metaphor, and in that metaphor, there are no such things as mirrors. We don't want to add mirrors into the metaphor. It's just that a thing isn't aware of itself. So if you can observe something, you're the observer, then what you observe is not you, because you don't observe yourself. You just are. And you don't have a lot of insight into the I am, is what he calls it. So in that context, that is right. Okay, the next was he wanted to know about the big C, the little c, and can you grow up without ever reaching out to non-physical reality experientially? Well, big C consciousness, that's you at the IUOC, individuated unit of consciousness. That's the larger consciousness system. You as an individuated unit of consciousness are a piece of this larger consciousness system. So big C consciousness, as I've used it before, it just differentiates that part of consciousness from the little c consciousness, which is the consciousness that is the subset of the IUOC that is plugged into or logged on to the avatar. That's the little c consciousness. Okay, that's what we think of as our personal consciousness. It's the free will awareness unit. It's a subset of something bigger, which is a subset of something bigger. So to differentiate that part of our consciousness, free will awareness unit, from all the rest of it, I called it big C, little c, although that big C contains the larger conscious system and an IUOC. All right, now it says, most importantly, what a regular person here in PMR is able to deduce of themselves or out of it in themselves without reaching out to the NPR experientially. You can do everything here without reaching out to the non-physical experientially. That is not important. That's a side issue. It's mainly important for people who are very left brain, very logical process oriented, who can't take the next step forward unless they can have an experience of this larger consciousness system, because until they have the experience of it, it isn't real. Okay? So those people who can't intuit it, don't get it intuitively, don't see the reality of it in a way that is deeper than logic. They then need this experience in the non-physical, because that then convinces them that, whoa, there is a reality out here that's different than the one I live in, and it's a superset to the one I live in. You can often convince yourself of that by doing things like remote viewing, healing, interacting with other beings with telepathy, things that are easy to do and are evidential. You can do these things and then check out your remote view. Was what's there, what you saw was there? Well, if it's not, then you weren't there. You just thought you were. If you are seeing those things, if you are able to heal, if you are able to connect with people at an intuitive, telepathic level, then after you've done it hundreds and hundreds of times, you no longer have this question of, is that possible? Because the only way that could be possible is if there is another reality that is superset to this reality. So then, bingo, you've convinced yourself that that's real, and now you can go on. And until you convince yourself of that, you can't go on, because you're stuck in a left brain that wants to know. Sort of like Vanessa there, who gets stuck in her need to know and makes it difficult for her to go on to the next step until she finds out. So if you are intellectual like that, then it seems to be important for you. Otherwise, your process stops. But it isn't really important at all. It's only important to the intellect. It's not important to the being. At the being level, what you're trying to do is become love. You don't have to ever get outside of this reality to become love. What you're trying to do at the being level is let go of your fear, get rid of the ego and the belief, be whole. You can do that without ever going to any place non-physical, you see? So it's not important to do those things. That's just a way, kind of a strategy that we use for people who live out of their heads, are very intellectual, to get them over this hurdle of, is it real? Because I don't want to invest any of my time or energy if it's not real. So first I have to know it's real before I will worry about getting rid of fear or love or any of the rest of that stuff. I need to know that there really is a larger system and that this is its purpose. So for those people, it's something that helps them out to be able to do it. But even those people, if they could put that living out of their head aside and say, well, whether it's real or not, becoming love, getting rid of fear, getting rid of the ego and beliefs is really a good thing anyway. Whether it's real or not, that's a good thing all in itself. And they could just start from there and grow up, even if they did live out of their heads. And that growing up would be just as useful and just as important to them as it would be if they went into the non-physical first. So it's really not necessary for anybody to ever go and experience non-physical reality. Growing up is what we're here for. The experiencing of the reality frames is an extra. If that's useful to you, then go do it. If it's not, You don't have to do it in order to grow up. So, Vanessa, you can always feel like you're doing it, you're succeeding, and you're becoming, less fearful, more love, less ego, and just feeling that, you should feel successful rather than feeling failed because you can't get into the non-physical. I'm a failure. I'm failing at this. I'm not doing it. You see, well, what you're not doing is something that's really not all that important anyway. So that's kind of the idea here. So if what's important, is what you want to work on, then work on getting rid of the fear, getting rid of the ego, getting rid of the beliefs. That's important. You don't need to get into the non-physical to do that. And that's really what it's all about. Okay. Let's see. What was the very last part of that? Let's see. In a way of a shortcut, if we assume that our true me can be best experienced from the state of point consciousness, who are we right then, right there and then? Okay. In point consciousness, he says, are we an individuated unit of consciousness or are we a free will awareness unit? We are a free will awareness unit, of course, that is part of an individuated unit of consciousness. Because when we go into point consciousness, we are going there through the effort of a free will awareness unit. Free will awareness unit is opening up its mind within its context of being immersed with this avatar. Okay, so the free will awareness unit is what you are at that point. You're a subset of consciousness that has logged on to this avatar, and now you're letting the avatar go. You said, forget the avatar. I'm consciousness, and I want to experience as consciousness. So that's what you are as point consciousness. You're a free subset of consciousness with free will, but you are still logged on to that avatar. You're just not paying attention to the avatar. You're ignoring the avatar and that virtual reality entirely and just experiencing yourself as consciousness. All right. Okay, Keith, that takes us to part 2.
Part 2, of what, Tom? Part 2 of his question. I don't have a part 2.
Yes.
Oh, in that case, maybe you can read it out.
Okay. Some of those ideas come from a model called transurfing, which encompasses such things as balancing forces and pendulums and egregores. It's a new word for me. I have never, to my recollection, heard from Tom on egregores, well, it's because I've never heard about those either. And balancing forces. Is it something that you are familiar with and have observed in non-physical reality? And it goes on to explain. Egregores are supposed to be low-level beings that arise from groups of people, a group consciousness, if you will. However, their purpose is to treat each member as sort of a battery and then drive its own existence by steering each member of a group in a given direction. Okay? Now, it's an egregore. Balancing powers would be akin to a mechanism that is meant to steer people away from putting priority on anything other than evolution towards the source, God. If you care about a car the most in your life, balancing forces are supposed to step in and knock it down for you to realize that it is not a worthwhile pursuit. Is such a thing a tool at the dispense of the system, or more of a gimmick introduced by the author of this model to make his model more viable? Well, what these things are metaphors, at best. They're just simply metaphors. No, these things don't exist as separate entities. There is no egregore that basically has its own free will that kind of takes over the group and then uses mind control to steer the group in the direction that it wants to go. No, that's not the case. A group consciousness is a sum of all the consciousness of all the members. So let's say a group has 10 members, then the group consciousness is a vector sum of those 10 members. If that defines the group, that's the group consciousness. So it's not a thing that exists with its own free will that then steers the group around. So I'd say that is just a kind of a fantasy, because what people have seen that makes them think this would be true is they notice that a group, like a mob, will act differently than any one of the people in the mob. You get a mob, and the mob is much lower quality, can make worse decisions than any of the individuals would make by themselves. But that's not because there's some being that has been created above them that's now pushing them on to more and more evil. That's because that evil was in there all along, but it was restrained by their sense of propriety and their sense of what was right, and their sense of perhaps fairness or ethics. But once they get in a group, and that group validates a lack of ethics or validates vindictiveness or something like that, then that thin veneer of civilized behavior starts to come off, and what's left is what these people truly are underneath the hood. What do you got under the hood? Well, you've got a lot of fear and ego that enables you to do some pretty awful things that you wouldn't do when you were restrained by your own sense of propriety and perhaps sense of ethics, or sense of being singled out, or sense of being caught and being thrown in jail. But now you're with these other people, and they're gung ho, so you're gung ho with them. That's just a descending to the common denominator of the group, of the various people in the group consciousness, and that's what happens. There's that lowest common denominator of the group. What's the lowest thing that any of these people are in this group? Well, that's what the group becomes. Kind of sinks to the lowest level of its members. So it's not really a being, and I can see why people might think that's what's going on. They're as a group, they're being taken over by something bigger that's evil and drives them forward, but it's not it at all. They're just being themselves. And when they're nicer and kinder, they're acting. They're acting more civilized because they've learned that from their culture. Now, what about this mechanism that pushes people toward growing up and becoming love? And if they fall in love with their car or their house or their status or their job, and they think that's the most important thing in their life, the balancing forces kind of take them down a peg or two to show them that it isn't. Well, that's not another being either. That's just the way the system works. The system works that if you're running on ego, you tend to poison your own game. You tend to mess things up. So that's just the nature of consciousness. When you're making choices that are poor, they tend to eventually it bites you. And bad choices create bad things that happen. So if your whole life is wrapped around your status, then eventually that'll probably make you self-destruct. You'll get to a point where life isn't worth living anymore. So these are just natural things that people see, and when they see it, they make up metaphors to describe it and explain them. And then the problem is they, instead of just thinking those are metaphors, they begin to believe that the metaphors are real things. So science does the same thing. I wouldn't give this guy any black stars for that, because almost everybody does the same thing. We make up metaphors and then we tend to believe them. That they're real and not really metaphors. It's just the way we tend to work. All right, so that's part 2. Ready to go on, Keith?
Oh, I thought you was going to tell me there might be a part 3.
No,
okay,
that's it.
Okay, Adam joined us about 30-40 minutes ago. He's got a question for you. Adam, it's all yours.
Hey, what's up, Tom? Good to see you, pal.
Hi, Adam. Good to see you again.
Yeah. We talked a while ago about media and how I was becoming kind of less tolerable with violent media. I couldn't take it anymore. And my question today is more about children's media. And I'm just looking for your perspective on it. I'm wondering, what concepts shouldn't you introduce to a child? What should, what's too much? What maybe not good to see? because a lot of Disney movies and stuff, they have really content that's powerful, or extreme in some cases, of parents dying and stuff. And I'm just looking for your opinion on that.
Okay, as a parent, you should be very concerned with what your children see. The kind of media that they engage in, and you should be a censor to censor out the stuff that you think is not good for them, because children aren't able to make those decisions themselves. Now, when they get to be, 15, 16, 17 and higher, well, now they're starting to make those decisions for themselves, and you need to back off and let them kind of do whatever they do. But when they're 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 7 and so on, they can't make those kinds of choices. And our culture expresses itself in terms of our media. And if we have a culture that is very self-centered, that is all about power and force, then that's what we're going to express in our writing, in our pictures, in our movies. We're going to express that ethic of power and force and domination and that kind of thing. So it's hard to take your child out of its culture. It's in its culture. And it's, you can't put your child in a closet and keep them in there, until they're 25 and let them out and figure, well, now you're an adult, you can go, mix it up in the real world. That's not a good thing. So they are going to get that at other kids' houses, just like you may not feed them sugar. But when they go to, Susie or George's house, they're going to get a handful of cookies because that's what mom's going to serve. So you have to realize that your children are going to get acculturated into their culture, whether you like it or not. But you can, the younger they are, prevent some of the worst sorts of stuff from them having to deal with it too early. The older you get, the more able they're to deal with things. So I would say, if you look at some kid vid things are very good. Like Sesame Street was very good for kids. Daniel Tiger's one I've seen recently because I have grandkids, so I get to keep up with this sort of thing a little bit. And my grandchild was watching Daniel Tiger in the lesson about mom and dad always come home, that sort of thing. And those sorts of things are very good. Children will learn a lot from those, and they get a sense of security out of watching those things. On the other hand, you have Power Rangers, and it's all about force and violence. If there is a problem, the way you solve it is with force. No Power Ranger ever sits down with the bad guy to have a discussion about, how to do things better. It's all about force and violence. Well, that's another very, ubiquitous thing on the TV. And little boys, much more than little girls, are naturally about force, fighting, and violence. That's part of the male, instincts. And that's the way we think and the way we do things. So little boys just light right up with Power Rangers and Superman and Spider-Man and all the heroes because that resonates with them and with their instincts. Little girls, less so, but perhaps still some. In any case, you can't take their instincts away from them either. That's another thing that you just have to deal with. You can't try to make them into something that they're not. But you can police the airwaves to the point that, whatever they pull up on their little computer that they have, and these days, by the time you're 5 years old, you have your first computer of some sort, even if it's just a tablet. You need to be very careful about what it is they can log into and what it is they can see, because that internet's just wide open. Everything's there, and there's very few. Kind of the biggest gate, the strongest gate that's out there is that if you're not 18, don't click here. That's not exactly a very securely locked gate, but that's about as strong a gate as there is out there. So you have to be pretty careful about limiting their access to adult material when they can't process adult material. They're not old enough with enough experience to process that. So it's not healthy. It's not good for them to get things that they can't understand or can't process. They will see it in a kind of a cockeyed way that will be, perhaps, depending on them and their particular personality, could be not good for them. So yeah, I just watch it, and you're not going to stop your little boys from being Power Rangers or Ninja Turtles or any of that other stuff that kids see, because boys will be boys. That's what that Y chromosome does to us. It makes us interested in those kinds of things. That's the way boys play. It's a lot about force and violence and that sort of thing. But you don't have to go buy them 6 different kinds of guns, that fire, things at each other, or you can keep the violence to a minimum when they start fighting with each other. Kind of teach them respect and how to deal, give them some education on how to resolve problems and issues other than force. I don't know. I just say our media represents the quality of our consciousness, which isn't very high. So you as a parent need to realize that some things just aren't appropriate for your children. And though they will deal with them sooner or later, they don't have to deal with them at 3 years old. 3-year-old shouldn't have to deal, with his parents being murdered. That's just not something a 3-year-old is going to process. Well, they process something very similar to that, when Bambi's mother gets shot, right? I mean, that's, here's a little Bambi, the star of the show, and his mother gets blown away by a hunter. Well, a lot of kids found that traumatic, were terrified and, couldn't sleep and had nightmares, for 2 or 3 years afterwards. Other kids watched it, no problem. In one ear, out the other. They didn't internalize it. So it kind of depends on the child and where they are, their level of security, what worries them, how much do they think? Some children are very, they think too much. In a sense, they confuse themselves because they don't have enough understanding or experience to make things out of what they see. But if they're very intellectually driven, and even a 4-year-old can be intellectually driven, some kids are and some aren't. If they're very intellectually driven, this stuff bothers them a lot more than if they're not. They don't connect to it personally, maybe, if they're not. So it depends on your child. But yeah, it's something to be very cautious about. You can help your kids grow up healthy just by limiting a lot of the unhealthy stuff that they might see otherwise. They're going to get it eventually anyway, but hopefully they'll be older and will be able to process it better than they would be if they got it, at home at a very early age, which means you have to watch what you watch. Because you may watch Death and Destruction on the tube because it amuses you, because you're a part of this culture. But that doesn't mean that your 3-year-old ought to be in there watching it with you. And if your 3-year-old needs to be with you because you're the parent, then you just need to watch something else. And you go to YouTube and bring up a Daniel Tiger episode, and that's what you watch until your 3-year-old goes to bed, that sort of thing. So the parents have to take that responsibility.
It's definitely interesting raising a kid with the MBT perspective and being hyper aware of culture and family culture and personal culture and how all those things are kind of mixing together. Yeah. But thanks. That's a great perspective. Thanks for sharing that with me, Tom.
You're welcome.
All right, forum user Zach McCracken asks, when you interact with someone in a dream, are you actually interacting with their individuated unit of consciousness, or is the larger consciousness system using a non-player character?
It could be either. You could be interacting with them. People sometimes can have dreams together, and they both remember it, and both can bring up details about it. So that's possible. It doesn't happen very often, but it might be actually the other person. And that person could be aware of it. People do go on joint dreams together occasionally, but that's in the margins. The next thing down from that would be that you're interacting with another person at their free will awareness unit level, and you're interacting with them in some way. because you can do that. We're all netted. We're all communicating with each other. So if it's a dream about a specific person, there may be a connection with that person's free will awareness unit, and they may not be aware of it. They may not have any awareness of it, or it could just be a stand-in, because most of our dreams are symbolic. They're metaphors, and your friend that's in this dream may just be a metaphor for something in that dream, and has nothing to do with your friend, other than the fact that your friend makes a good metaphor. Makes a good metaphor for that person you like and trust, okay? And that's just a kind of a character in your dream, is some person that you would like and trust. And they give that the face of your friend because that's what that means to you. That's a good metaphor for you. So dreams are like that. In that case, that particular individual in your dream would just be a symbol, a metaphor. So it could be any of the above possibilities. Are all there, but mostly it's just metaphors and symbols in your dreams. Most of the time, the people that you meet in your dreams that you know in waking life just represent a type of person, or the way you think about them is then made into a metaphor. It's not really about that person so much. Most of the time is the way it is. Not always, but that's more typical.
All right. Thanks, Tom. I have a three-part question from channel 79 on nudging and external interference. Tom, we can be nudged by the non-physical guidance in this physical matter reality if it can encourage us towards growth opportunities. So question one, are the NPMRN beings also nudged by the system that contains their system, or did they evolve completely without external interference?
I've not really considered that, but just give me a second or two. I'd say yes, but at a much lower level of occurrence. In other words, you can always be nudged by anyone. Actually, we can communicate. We're all netted. Okay, all consciousness is netted together. So you can use your intent and nudge somebody else with your intent. It's a telepathic communication you make with them across the consciousness network, if you will. So those sorts of things are doable within all consciousness. So all the way up to the larger consciousness system, and if we call that like the highest level of consciousness structure, then yes, that structure can nudge us and nudge anything else, and we can send messages to it. Although our message probably isn't much of a nudge to the system, but it might, make the system think about something it otherwise wasn't thinking about. So we all nudge each other. So I'd say yes, the nudges go around all over, and many times those entities that are kind of in the management of, say, a virtual reality like ours, or even of the N division, which is several virtual realities like ours, we can nudge them some, they can nudge us some, and they probably get nudges from above and below and crossways as well from their peers. So nudges are available all around because we're all netted.
All right, and question two says, can you say just how common it is for physical matter reality and non-physical matter reality systems to actually receive external interference? And three was, how do the results of the different approaches actually vary? Do you personally have a preference?
We don't get a lot of, quote, interference, unquote, or we could also call that interference help if it was meant for something to help us grow up. We can get some things that are called interference because, like I say, IUOC to IUOC, or free will awareness unit to free will awareness unit, you can get things that are interference. It's possible that you could get that. Mostly it doesn't happen very much, but that's possible. We don't get a lot. Mostly we are left to make our own choices according to our own free will, and then we suffer the joys of the consequences, the results anyway, of what our choices are. And that's what we do here. The nudging is mostly done by the LCS, by the system, to help us on our way, to help us grow up, like the gentleman who was here earlier who got nudged with this idea that, he had potential. He could become something good, something great. Just he could lower his entropy. That would make him great. That would be good. And he had the ability to make the choices to do that. And to give him that idea when he felt that maybe there was no hope that he could ever do anything was something that kept him going. So that's the kind of nudge we often get from the system that just helps us get by. And that's typically the sort of nudges we have to put up with. The nudges that we get, say, from peers, we can kind of filter those out. We tend to not be pushed around by that. We tend to filter it, just like that friend was talking to us. A friend talks to you, you may or may not take his advice. Most of the time it's not. We tend to make our own choices for our own reasons and don't take advice very often or very well. So that typically is the way we are, even if the advice comes telepathically. We're not slaves to those kinds of nudges. We can always say no.
Hey, Tom, Keith gave me permission to, I had a little story to tell you I thought you'd appreciate about data streams in a virtual reality. So I was playing a virtual reality game a little while back, and we were hunting orcs. We were hunting all these orcs. They were NPCs, and we were their corpses were all littering the ground. It was, taking up the entire screen, and it was getting really difficult for me to even do anything in the game because all I could see were just these orcs. And so someone told me all I had to do was type in /hide corpse all, and as soon as I did that command, all the corpses were no longer in my data stream anymore. And anything that were on their bodies and any items it was no longer accessible to me. And to think I was I was playing for nearly a half hour with that in my reality, where this person, it wasn't even a part of his reality, but we were right next to each other sharing the same space. And I thought that was, almost exactly how it works here, in that someone could be seeing, a UFO or something right in front of them, and the person next to them, it's just not in their data stream, that. And I had that moment. I thought you'd appreciate that little story.
Yes, that can happen. That does happen sometimes. I read a story about some people who heard a lot of noise, a lot of booms, flashes of light, went outside. There were like 4 or 5 of them in a house. They went outside, they looked, they saw a big fireball going up over an area where there was a petroleum storage or something, fire engines, sirens, all kinds of mayhem going on because there was some kind of a catastrophe happening not that far away. And they had someplace, at least a couple of them stayed home there. And people were out in the yards, the neighbors, everybody was out in their yards looking to see what was going on, because you could see this 5-10 miles away. So they talked to neighbors, what's going on? Do you know? If you heard, what's happening over there? And anyway, they left after a while. Some of the people in this house left, went someplace, came back. And all the people in their house that were together, everybody had seen that. Everybody had gone out. They'd all talked to their neighbors, but the neighbors didn't know anything about it. What fire? No sirens, no police, no fire trucks, nothing. Yet there was a bunch of people in the house who lived through that scenario. And they got complete deadpan from all the people that was in their neighborhood. Nobody heard any of it. Just a different data stream. So that kind of thing does happen here sometimes, and it happens for a reason. It was a lesson. It was a lesson for them. They were getting a special data stream that gives them some special challenges as to how they would interact with that. It's almost like a dream, but it's not in the dream reality. It's here in the physical reality. And those things happen, but they're in the margins. They don't happen often. So it's not like, everybody has these kinds of experiences. It's a very, very rare experience to do that. And the system is only going to do that for a special case where certain people need a certain experience to grow up or to get a bigger idea And it just creates that experience for them in their own private data stream. That happens. Yeah, I also knew a guy who had a problem with his cell phone, and he kept losing his cell phone, and he would find it in the strangest places. So his cell phone would just disappear, and then he'd find it in his sock drawer, and then the next week it would disappear, and he'd find it, like in the washing machine, not run, not wet, just in the washing machine, or he'd find it, some other place, just odd places like that, and it kept happening to him. That stuff would just disappear and then show up someplace someplace he'd never been, or someplace that he wouldn't go. And it was just the system telling him that this reality isn't as buttoned down as you think. It's a stranger place. And that got him interested in, going to the net and looking up, strange things, which led him into, non-physical, which led him into my books, which was why he communicated with me, and told me about the things that had happened. So it got him going as a seeker because he had these experiences. So yes, just a different data stream than other people just for that person. So those kinds of things do happen. But also your comment on you and your friends and you're fighting orcs and there's bodies everywhere also is a comment on that violent reality that you were talking about that you want to save your children from.
I know. As soon as I was thinking of it, I was like, oh, man, burying my own grave here.
Yeah, talk about a culture that's acculturated to force and violence and whatever else. That's just the way our culture is. And that that Y chromosome tends to resonate with that sort of thing. So there you are. But you can handle it. A 3-year-old can't handle that. They can't process it. They can't make sense of it. They can't put that into perspective. For them, what they see on the TV is as real as what they see anywhere else. So when they're young like that, you have to protect them from those things that they cannot process. You can process it. Oh, it's just a game. It's not a problem. Nobody gets hurt. We're just playing this game. But, oh, it's just a movie. There is no Bambi. And Bambi didn't have a mother, and she really didn't get killed. It's just a movie. Somebody made that up. Well, tell that to a 3-year-old, and it won't help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's too much. That's too much to take, in my mind, at least. Too much.
What do you mean Bambi is just a movie? Sorry? Okay. So moving swiftly on from that then. MBT forum user Now In says, hi Tom, now and then I meet people who need feedback to their actions that they probably will find unpleasant. Before I stumbled upon MBT, I often used to give feedback that was depending on how much my ego flared up in a microsecond or two. Of course, this resulted in feedback that was way too much, and the total entropy got much higher than before the feedback, if you want to use MBT terms. But that was just me being authentic. But after I found MBT, I've tried to adjust my reaction to stuff that annoys me, mostly by using my intellect and ignoring my ego. I know that what annoys me most is mostly dependent on my fear and ego, but sometimes people do things that 99% of the world's population would say is simply wrong. And I have to agree with him. It would be wrong just to ignore it, surely, just to keep the entropy low in the short term. Do we just walk away and let the police or other capable person step in after a while and do the dirty work? I guess my question is this: what is the appropriate amount of negative or positive, in some cases, feedback?
Well, it just depends on your intent. You see, you're trying to group, all of your reactions into one basket, and there are times when you need to step in. There's times when you need to know that enough is enough. That's, we're not talking about MBT is not a pacifist philosophy that says no matter what happens, you just stand by and watch it. You're not to interfere. You're not to, push back. If you get pushed, you don't push back. If somebody steals your children, you don't push back. You have to let them get away with that because they will learn their own lesson in their own time. And you never fight, you never get violent for any reason, or you become part of the problem. We don't think that way. I don't think that way, and MBT doesn't think that way. There's a time to stand up and measure up to your responsibilities. If somebody's bothering a child and it's not their parent, parents are allowed to bother children. Parents are allowed to spank children and to pick them up and haul them off, but others aren't if it's not their child. And if you see something that looks like abuse, you should step into it carefully, because you're not sure what the circumstance is. But if you feel like it's something you need to do, then do it. That's being authentic. Most of the time, the things you talk about, people irritate you. It's not them, it's you. You choose to be irritated. It's your own sense of ego that creates the irritation. You feel slighted, or you feel like unfairly dealt with, or whatever, and then your ego swells up and you get maybe boisterous or loud or upset or something. Well, that's yours to fix. And you don't fix that by, slapping the other person and telling them never say that again in front of me. You see, that would be where your violence is not part of the solution, it's part of the problem. Other times, your violence may be part of the solution. If somebody's doing something really terrible and evil and you get a chance to stop it, well, stop it. Don't just let it go on because it's not your personal problem. You need then to rise to the occasion. So it gets down to, what is your intent? What's your intent to do this? If your intent is to get even, to make yourself feel better, and your intent is born out of your ego and from your fear, then that's not a good thing to do. If your intent is born out of caring for other, then it probably is a good thing to do. So you have to understand the situation, understand all the interactions going on, and be careful and, keep your mind and ears and eyes open to what's happening and what's going on and why. But then if you feel like you need, because other is going to depend on you, or the other, like your children, are your responsibility to take care of, well, then you need to step up, perhaps, and be violent. You don't just sit by and let the evil run over you because you don't want to act the same way they do. You're not acting the same way they do. The ethics, the morality of your actions are not the action itself, it's the intent behind the action. If the intent behind the action is one of lowering entropy, is one of caring for others, then proceed carefully. If your intent is about self, it's about me, that upsets me. I don't like them doing that to me. Then perhaps you ought to think a little bit more about, is it your fear and your ego, or does something really need to be said to this person? Maybe they are acting very rudely, and maybe they're not aware of it. And maybe you should mention that, that's not a good way to, interact with people or something. But if all that does is make it worse, if all that does is throw gasoline on the fire, then that was the wrong thing to do. You see? So your own experience will help you understand when's a good time, and understand the person, when's the time to say something, when's not. Perhaps that rude person that you're talking about, instead of confronting them, which would just make them ruder and make the whole thing worse, you should perhaps just turn the other cheek. And later, when they're not in a rage, you might have a heart-to-heart talk in a case where they could maybe listen to what you had to say. But right then at that time would be a poor choice. So it's not that morality doesn't go with the action. It goes with the intent, and you have to use wisdom in applying that intent to action. So you need to pick your times to minimize the overall entropy that's going to happen. So if you get in the way of evil, that's good. You're minimizing the entropy. If you say things that just infuriate somebody who's already infuriated, and you infuriate them more, you're just raising the entropy. That's not a good thing. Even if you're right and they're wrong, doesn't matter. It makes things worse. It's not about being right. It's about, at the end of the day, is entropy higher or lower because of what you said or did or thought? That's kind of the key. So there isn't anything that says, in all instances, act like this. That doesn't work. It's your intent, and your intent is based on whether you're going to raise or lower the entropy in the long term.
All right, Tom, thank you very much. John has a question he wants to ask about music. Very nice. John, it's yours.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah. It's very interesting to hear you talk about music, Tom. You mentioned that we have a limited perspective about music, and that was interesting to hear. At the moment, there's a kind of musical revolution going on where musicians are tuning their instruments to 432 hertz instead of 440 hertz. And also, this is connected with binaural beats, because if you Google binaural beats, you get 432 hertz binaural beats and also 528 hertz as well. And there's that guy, Dr. Horowitz, is going around. He's touring around the world talking about 528 hertz being the love frequency, and that you can make plants grow faster with it. You can purify water with it and all kinds of things like that. So I'd be very interested to hear your comments about this.
Well, sound affects us in ways that are beneath our intellect. Obviously, we hear music and we respond to that music emotionally. We respond to that music at a being level, not an intellectual level. So it's a thing that communicates with us at the being level, or can communicate with us at the being level. I guess it depends on what kind of music and what your preferences are. We could just intellectually listen to music, but mostly we're talking about if you're listening to it at the being level, that's where it has significance and meaning to you, where it can make you cry or make you laugh. And with that sort of communication to yourself at the being level, then yes, certain frequencies tend to have various effects on our physiology, which also then affects our, what our consciousness can do with us. For instance, the 4 hertz binaural beat, which uses 2 frequencies that are just different by 4 hertz, the difference frequency is the 4 hertz, that will tend to drive EEG, brainwaves, down into the theta state, into the 4 hertz state. And that's true of any sort of frequency. It's more powerful if it's a binaural beat, which means, frequency 1 in this ear, frequency 2, 4 cycles different in this ear. So let's say 100 in this ear and 104 in that ear. The difference is 4 cycles. That'll produce a beat frequency of 4 cycles per second in the corpus callosum between the 2 hemispheres. And that tends to entrain the brain or push the brain toward theta state EEG, brainwave production. So it has effect on us. And that 4 hertz theta brainwave production corresponds to a kind of a mental state, a consciousness state, if you will. That's a place where the consciousness is more, you're more aware at an intuitive level at that state, more tuned with your free will awareness unit. So things like that happen. Now, if you just hear the 4 hertz beat in air, so now I have a speaker, and I have a speaker with, let's see what I have over here, 100 hertz here, and then a speaker with 104 hertz here, and they're just putting stuff out into the room. I still hear a 4 hertz beat in the air. It's not as powerful as one that's binaural, but it still works. It still tends to encourage a little more production of theta, EEG output. So music has that ability. And if it's not in the theta, if it's up at the beta region or up at even higher frequencies than that, it tends to make maybe clarity. It makes you maybe more aware, more solidly here, not so attached to your intuition, more focused here. So different frequencies can affect the mood that we're in and the way we process information. So yes, it can be a powerful thing. Now, unless you do it in stereo, you can't do isolated stereo like in a headset. You can't do binaural, but you can do it out of speakers like you would if listening to a band or somebody play. It's a weaker effect, but it still has an effect. Those things can affect us. You notice in a lot of ancient peoples, they would have drumming as a part of their culture. And that drumming almost always was, around that same frequency that you're talking about, the drumming circles and the drumming. And if you do that, then you drop people more into a theta state. Alpha states relax you. Theta state is more into your intuition, a little deeper. Then you go down lower, you lose consciousness. That's the delta region. So the drumming, the music, the beats, and you can have two instruments, and those two instruments can be tuned such that they create a 4 hertz between them. You can have one buddy hitting this tone and another one has just got their strings just a little tighter, which raises their frequency up just a little bit. And you can create overtones between things that are in the lower frequency ranges that can affect the EG. So it's a pretty complex thing. And I guess musicians, if they have a lot of experience with what makes audiences mellow and what makes audiences, jump up and boogie, they probably have an idea of what kind of sounds create what kind of feelings among their audiences. And eventually they could figure out ways to play music that produces a certain effect in their audience. So I think all that's probably got merit to it if it's done carefully. Now, I don't think I'd worry about mind control, that somebody's going to get up and play a song and we're all going to turn into zombies and get up and, walk off without bending our knees and, holding our hands up in front of us and, go out to, rob a bank or something because we heard the rob a bank song. It's not going to do that. All it does is it kind of decreases the barriers toward being in that state. So if you're in a normal awake state in a concert, there's a certain amount of barrier to being in a theta state because there's a lot of action going on in things. You're focused, your intent's flying around, your attention's flying around to different things. And that's not consistent with a theta state. So these are all barriers to a theta state. Then the musicians come on and play something of the right frequency, and now those barriers are reduced and the theta state is easier to attain even with stuff going on. So it just makes it kind of easier to attain, but it doesn't force it. Nobody's forced to go into a state. Nobody's forced to respond in that way. You kind of, it's like with hypnotherapy. You have to be, you have to go along with the hypnotherapist. If you go to a hypnotherapist and you just sit there and he's talking to you and trying to put you into a hypnotic trance and you're saying, no, I'm not going to let you do that. I'm not going to cooperate with that. Well, it won't. It just won't work. You can't be forced, but it can reduce the barrier so that you just kind of go there easily. So it's not a matter of they're going to play music that'll turn us all into zombies or something, but they can make it easier for us to relax or feel good or jump up and down and get excited. That's what happens when they communicate directly to your emotional centers.
Okay, so do you think it's a good thing that musicians are changing from 440 hertz to 432? Should I tune my guitar to 432 now?
Well, it depends on what your goals are, I guess. It depends on what you're doing. Are you trying to, calm your children, or are you trying to, make something that'll sell a lot on the, if you want to sell music, you need music that grabs people, maybe gets them excited, or maybe grabs them at some other emotional level, and that's not what's going to put somebody to sleep or make them calm. So it kind of depends on what it is you're trying to do. I wouldn't say that you just want to retune just in general. I think it would depend on what's your purpose, what's your point, what are you going to do with your music, and then kind of retune accordingly.
So you're saying that 432 makes people more relaxed. I mean, we just want to get a better, more stronger emotional connection, really, no matter what the music is. It could be upbeat, could be, relaxing, whatever.
I'd have to look at those frequencies, 432. I'd have to look at that and see just how that comes out as far as, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about those particular frequencies and what they might do to really give you information on that. I know more about what the binaural beats do at certain frequencies, but I don't know about the ones you're talking about, so I can't really say. But if you find something that's more relaxing, that may be a good thing if what you're trying to do is relax people. If what you're trying to do is get people excited, make them stand up and dance, then you don't want to relax people. You want to hype them up. So, people use sometimes minor chords for that, and very exciting, riffs on the guitar or on the piano to grab people's attentions and hype them up rather than relax them. So it just depends on what you're trying to do. But I don't think necessarily that any particular frequency is going to be the best thing all the time. Play with what sounds good.
Okay, I see. So you don't think there's any truth to this 528 love frequency stuff then?
Probably not much, but I'd have to read some about it and get more of the details. But in general, all you're doing is making, you're in a very minor way, you're making certain attitudes and states of mind easier to get to. You're not forcing anything. If people don't want to get there, they won't get there no matter what you play. So you're just making some, maybe even attitudes and feelings a little easier for them to get to. But if they don't want to, they won't. You're not going to change anyone by playing music to them. So I'd need to read about that. You maybe send me a source or something that I can find out more of the technical details of exactly what you're talking about, and then I might have a different opinion. Okay,
thanks. There could be something in it that there's a stronger emotional connection in these frequencies, but I'm not sure either.
Yeah, it could be. I know sound and emotion are connected, and mental state, they're all connected. So whether there's one sound that works for everybody one way, probably not. People are different. Even in the binaural beats, there's different kinds of beats work better for some and not so good for others. So the fact that there's just this one frequency and that affects everybody the same way, probably not true. But it may affect, maybe a majority of people, possibly. But I wouldn't think a sound played out of a speaker is going to have a very big effect in any case. My guess is it would be very minor. Just maybe be pleasant. People may like it. But, what you find pleasant in music depends on what your ear has grown up with. If you live in the East, there's a whole different set of tonal qualities that people find pleasing that just irritate Westerners to no end because it's a different, it's a different style of music.
Okay, thanks a lot.
John, whatever you have got on the love frequency, John, send it over to me and we'll have a look at it. Keith at mbtevents.com. I know we've said in the past to anyone out there, if you are inspired as a musician by MBT, you've got music or songs, let us know. We'd like to hear from you about it. Specifically, if you've had experience with this 432 hertz and it's worked for you, we'd like to hear from you. The other thing is the binaural beats that Tom mentions. He did create a set back in 2015. They are available from the mbtevents.com website for $20. Okay, I've got to move on. Adam, you got a question, a follow-up music question, I believe.
Yeah, to stay on the music topic, Tom, I'm wondering what is the extent of information that you can transmit just from music? Can you transmit these ideas of a bigger picture just from a song, just from sound? Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, you're not going to transmit a bigger picture to somebody just with the sound. I think that's not the case. What you can do is you can, again, lower the boundaries or lower the constraints on a particular emotion and feeling. So you can make somebody feel sad or melancholy or introspective if you've got that violin playing just the right way to make you, feel kind of mellow and introspective. Or you can make them anxious and jump up if you're playing stuff that makes them want to move instead of sit still. So you can affect people emotionally, but you're not going to change their picture. Now, if you add words to the song, then intellectually they can listen to the words, and that may help them see a bigger picture if the words are such that it triggers something in their mind that then makes sense. But mostly, no. Music is entertaining, and it changes your mood, and it sounds good, feels good, but it's not going to be a life changer. Unless you're the musician, then music can be a life changer.